Hello, and welcome to the International Early Learning and Children's Study webinar. I think the first thing that I really want to say to everyone who has participated is just thank you very much. This study has been a great success, and without your help, we just wouldn't have been able to go ahead. So thank you very much to everybody for all your hard work, and I'm hoping that you enjoy hearing about the findings from the results. I've just got a few housekeeping things to talk to you about. It's a weird time. Normally housekeeping at conference might involve me telling you where to go to the toilets, for instance, but it would be a very weird and quite unsettling event if I was to know where your toilet was. But there are other things that we need to go through. So if you do have any difficulties with the technical aspects of remaining online, please use the chat function to the host, Harjit. And she is here, but her camera is off, and she will try and help. Also, the session for the day is that we will have a presentation, and then we will have a panel, and each panelist will have 5 minutes. I'll introduce them in a minute. But we will be taking questions and answers throughout the time that throughout the time they're speaking, and so please use the question and answer panel in order to send those through to Maddie. Maddie Wheeler is our Director of Communications, and she will be collecting those so that they are ready for us to use in the final Q&A session. Finally, just before we start, I would like to say a huge thank you to our panelists today. We have Caroline Sharp, who is a Research Director at the National Foundation for Educational Research. We have Cassie Buchanan, who is an Executive Head Teacher, and I'll introduce her more fully later. We have Kathy Silver, who is a professor at Oxford, and also Iran, who is also a professor at Oxford, and we have Frances Forsyth, who is at the Department for Education. So I think that's all the housekeeping that I need to do, and without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to Caroline Sharp, who has been directing this work for the National Foundation for Education Research. Over to you, Caroline.
Hi everybody, and I'd just like to echo what Angela said at the beginning there, to thank everybody who's taking part, and I'm really looking forward to all your questions. But just for now, I'm going to share my screen, and hopefully this will work out, and I'll then run you through the key findings of the study. So, as Angela explained, I was the director, or am the director of the research team for England on behalf of the Department for Education for this new study. It's the first time the study's ever been done. It was designed by the OECD, and it was an international study with 3 other countries. I'll just run through for you a bit about the international findings, and then before I'll move on to talking about the findings in England specifically. So this is about the context of the study. And as I said, there were almost 7,000 children, all around the age of 5, from 3 countries. Now, Estonia is an interesting country internationally because it's one of the highest performing countries at age 15. The UK performs above the international average, and the USA performs similarly to the UK at age 15, apart from in maths, where they do slightly less well than the UK. Participation rates in the study were generally high, and particularly so in England, where 191 schools took part, and the participation rates were excellent. They were all over 90%, and that really helps us to make sure that the findings are representative of children of that age group. And now I'll talk to you about the domains that it measured, and these domains were all chosen because they are known through other research to be important with children's attainment and well-being whilst they're young, but also throughout their education and in their later life. In the cognitive domain, the study focused on development in emergent literacy and emergent numeracy. Now, the definition of emergent literacy in IELS is important because it's very specific to oral language, as you can see there. It's not about reading and writing, and the reason for that is because in other countries, they don't expect to teach children those skills until they're a bit older than 5. And because this was international, it was felt that that was important to make it internationally comparable. So another area is self-regulation, and this includes the skills of it's cognitive, well, it's related to cognitive development, but it's children's brain development, mental processing in memory and flexibility of thought, and being able to inhibit your immediate reactions, to think before you act. These skills are also sometimes referred to as the brain's executive function, and you might have heard of that term, or you might not. Social emotional skills are included in the study, and there are 5 of these, and they include 2 measures of empathy, children's ability to recognise and understand other people's emotions, as well as being sociable, being non-disruptive, and willing to trust others. In England only, we also added a measure of children's persistence and their physical development, including both fine and gross motor skill development. So here is a summary of the international comparisons from the study. The study was set so that the measures all had a mean score of 500. So that was the way in which those measures are set. And you can see on the right-hand side the 2 examples where England performed differently from the other 2 countries involved. Children in England had significantly greater development in emergent numeracy than children in either of the other 2 countries, and you can see that on the top of the 2 diagrams to the right-hand side. On the other hand, children in England had significantly lower development in inhibition. Now, inhibition in IELS means the ability to stop a habitual response when presented with new information. This was measured by children's ability to stop pressing a particular button on the tablet device when the rules of a game changed. It's a bit like a game of Simon Says. So if you have that in your mind, you have to keep doing something because the person presenting says, Simon says touch your head, etc. Simon says do this, do that, do the other thing. And then they just say, touch your toes. And that's the thing that you have to remember. You have to inhibit your quick response, which is to touch your toes, and remember that you only have to do that when Simon says it. So now moving on through some of the other findings. In the other cases, children in England had similar development to one of the other 2 countries. Mainly, actually, our children were similar in their responses to Estonia and largely greater than the USA. The difference, the exception is in two the social emotional measures, where children in England had similar development to the USA but lower than Estonia. But on the other hand, it's interesting to see that children in England and the USA were found to be less disruptive than children in Estonia. And now I'm going to move on to the findings from England, looking first at the differences between groups of children. So here we go. First, a look at the deprivation gap. Now, we know that children from more deprived backgrounds start school at a disadvantage, and we can see this in the IELS findings for England. 5-year-olds eligible for free school meals had significantly lower development in several measures across all of the domains. We calculated the difference in months. I'm sure those of you who've looked at the Eef Toolkit will be familiar with this kind of calculation. It's approximate, but it is quite helpful to get an impression of what the difference is. And we found that in this case, children who were eligible for free school meals were about 8 months behind those who weren't eligible for physical development, which was the one had the largest difference, ranging to 4 months for working memory and mental flexibility. And you can see also emergent literacy and emergent numeracy are also in the list, as is empathy. Now I'm moving on to children with special educational needs. I should first explain that the IELTS sample did not include special schools, so these are children in mainstream schools with an identified special educational need. Excuse me. 12% of children in the sample had a special educational need, most of which had difficulties with communication and interaction. For example, they had speech and language difficulties or autistic spectrum disorder. For children with special educational needs, the largest differences were in physical development and emergent literacy, where children with special educational needs were a year or more behind their classmates. The relationship with physical development is not due purely to physical disabilities, because only 4% of those with special educational needs in the sample had any physical disabilities. On the other hand, children with special educational needs were significantly more trusting of others. This isn't shown here on the slide because there wasn't a difference that was related to the age of the child, and therefore we weren't able to calculate the difference in months for that particular outcome. Now moving on to gender differences, there weren't very many of these, but girls were ahead of boys on a few measures, especially physical development and emergent literacy. But unlike the results of the early years foundation stage profile, IELTS did not find a significant gender difference in emergent numeracy. On the positive side, boys were slightly ahead of girls in inhibition. Now I'm just going to go on to English as an additional language and differences according to ethnicity. So there were some differences for children with English as an additional language, and they were largely behind children with English as their first language, particularly, as you might expect, is in emergent literacy, which you'll remember is largely oral literacy. So that would make sense. But they were also a small but significant amount behind other children in emergent numeracy, mental flexibility, working memory, and one of the measures of empathy. In terms of ethnicity, children from white ethnic backgrounds had statistically significantly greater development in emergent literacy than children from Asian and Black ethnic backgrounds, and these differences were approximately equal to 7 and 5 months respectively. And children from Black ethnic backgrounds were approximately 3 months behind children from white ethnic backgrounds in emergent numeracy. However, there is also likely to be a relationship between ethnicity and other characteristics which might be playing into this. So, for example, it could be something to do with their socioeconomic status and also their understanding of English, children with an additional language, because English was the language used for the tablet assessments. I'm now going to move on to some important findings on the home learning environment, which IELTS showed to have several positive relationships with children's development at age 5. So first of all, parents reading to their children, helping their children to read, and having more children's books at home were associated with positive development in several measures. And just to give you one example, reading to children at least 5 days a week was associated with greater development in emergent literacy and all measures within the self-regulation and the social emotional domains, when compared to children of parents who did this less than once a week. Interestingly, a far higher proportion of parents in children read to their children regularly. 59% of parents in England read to their children 5 to 7 days a week, compared with 43% in the USA and 28% in Estonia. This highlights the important role of schools in encouraging parents to read to their children. The benefit of parents having reciprocal conversations with children about children's feelings are perhaps a bit less well known, but 53% of parents in England reported having these conversations with children about their feelings on 5 or more days a week, which was the thing that was associated with greater development in emergent literacy compared to the minority of 3% who did so less than once a week. And the 81% of parents having such conversations with their children at least 3 days a week was also associated with greater development in emotion identification. Moving on to parental involvement with their children's school, and I think a lot of you will recognise this, but nevertheless it's quite an important finding and quite a strong one. The 69% of children whose parents were moderately or strongly engaged with activities at their children's school had greater development in 7 measures, compared with the 31% whose parents were slightly or not involved in activities at their children's school. Then we have some relationships with physical development. So children who drew pictures or painted at home on 3 or 4 days a week showed significantly greater physical development than children who did so less than once a week or never. And the 63% of the sample who attended special or paid for activities every week, but actually not very frequently, not more than 4 times a week, was associated with greater development across social, emotional and cognitive measures. Now, I mentioned that in England we added a measure about persistence, which we asked you, the teachers, to tell us about for each child. And persistence was defined as children's ability to continue with their planned course of action in spite of difficulties or obstacles. This was strongly and consistently associated with children's development across the domains. The 34% of children rated by their teachers as often or always persistent were ahead of the 18% rated as rarely or never persistent on a range of these measures. And you can see that here, the good news is that there is also evidence that persistence is not entirely an inbuilt personality trait, but it is something that can be encouraged successfully by adults. So my thinking is, if you are able to move children from the rarely persistent or never persistent category to the often or always persistent category, this could be important for their development. Just to round off this quick overview of the main findings, I wanted to highlight the interconnected nature of children's development at age 5. This means that children with a good development in one area are likely to have good development in other areas as well. This diagram shows the strongest relationships with a correlation of 0.5 or more, which is very high correlation, relatively speaking. But if we showed all of the significant relationships, this slide would become very crowded and look rather like a spider's web with almost all of the outcomes related to each other. having said that, the relationships with inhibition were slightly less strong. And just to round off, I wanted to let you know that there are quite a few publications on IELTS, some of which you might be aware of and some of which you might not be. For example, only last week, the OECD published a study called The Future at 5, which was all about the gender relationships with children's career choices, what they want to be when they grow up. And we have two new studies that we're currently working on and will be coming soon. The first of those is on deprivation, and the second one will be focusing on children's physical development. So that's everything from me, and just a final thank you once again, very heartfelt, because as we really do know that we couldn't do this without you. So thank you so very much for all your hard work in doing all of those questionnaires and encouraging everybody to take part.
Thank you very much, Caroline. So interesting and really important. And I've already got lots of questions, but I am not in any way as esteemed or knowledgeable as many of the panelists we have today. I'd like to first of all introduce our first panelist, who is Cassie Buchanan. I think I mentioned earlier on she's an executive head teacher, but oh no, that's not all. So she is the executive head teacher of Charles Dickens Primary School and Nursery. She's also a trust leader of the Charter Schools Educational Trust. I'm sure that you have her bio, but she's a national education leader. She's been an Ofsted inspector. There's lots and lots that Cassie has done. And I'd like to, first of all, just thank you again. And please, could you share with us some thoughts on the presentation?
Of course. I mean, it's lovely to see all these people joining. I mean, I think the first thing I would say is I hope, like I did, that you found the report really, really interesting. And I hope that you really enjoyed being part of it as well. For me, I see the study as a really great example of sector collaboration on something really important, early years. And if you are listening as an early years teacher, then, you know, I will always say to the teachers in my school, you are the most important teachers in the school. If we get this right, then the rest of education is so much easier. And what IELTS gave us was a chance to bring so many different elements of the sector together. So just on the call, having the DFE, the NFER, and people like Iram and Kathy, you know, in the same space, I think is so powerful. And hopefully we can do it again based on something else, or it's a platform where we can sort of continue the work together. I think fairly sort of clearly, much of this is just a validation of really strong early years settings, which develop the whole child. I mean, that's what I got from that web at the end with all the links tells me that you can't be a school or a nursery that does just one thing, that little people are little people and they need sort of developing in the round. And I think, you know, for me, I think it will start a really fascinating conversation with the school leaders that I work with. And the question that I will always ask, maybe selfishly, is, does this match my school? Does this match my setting? How can I relate this to what I know about my school? And I was particularly interested in exploring, you know, what makes emergent numeracy so strong overall? Is it taught curriculums? What are we doing really well that we can harness and share in English schools? I was also really interested in the noticeable disadvantage gap from a really early age. We talk about that gap growing, but oh my goodness, it was there at the start, and there most starkly in physical development, which I think was a surprise for me. I know that strand includes sort of fine motor skills, but even so, gosh, little children, you know, you'd think that wouldn't be the gap that we saw. I was also really interested in those early gender gaps and the differences between girls and boys, and what can we do really early on to close those gaps. I tell you, the one that was new for me was that link between emotional literacy in the home and positive development overall. The fact that children were understanding and had the words to describe how they were feeling actually has a real impact on their development overall. And what does that mean for us as schools? I was really interested in persistence and stronger developmental outcomes. And I suppose I'm thinking of the disbanded jigsaw that's sitting underneath my kitchen table at the moment that my smallest child, who's in reception, has given up on this afternoon. So I'm going to go back and pursue that with him. And the other thing, I think, at a time when parents are really taking the lead and we're helping them at home, we've just come back, but we have been helping parents do the teaching overall. The power of parents to support their children, and how do we support them? So I suppose that leads on to one of my other hats, which is leading a research school. So we're an EEF research school at Charles Dickens. And when anyone's involved in research or studies, I guess the key thing I want you to get out of it is I hope you really enjoyed it. And I hope you're now going to be sort of keen to carry on with exploring evidence-informed approaches in early years. There are loads within the EEF that, if you did find this interesting, are the kind of next steps for you. The EEF, there is an early years toolkit. People forget that, but there is an early years toolkit for the EEF. There are brilliant guidance reports on how to improve maths in early years, how to prepare for literacy, and also how to involve parents. So if you're looking for, if you think actually, well, that was us, you know, we'd like to get better, then go to the EF or contact your local research school, or contact me. If I'm not your local research school, I'm happy to direct you to whoever is. And also just read more widely. That's what this has made me think. If you don't know, then two of the ladies on the call, Ira and Kathy, have written the most amazing books, and actually it's their thinking about what makes a fantastic early years setting, which has really helped my school. So, you know, this isn't a one organisation task, is it? It's about everybody working together, and that's what's powerful about this. So I'm just looking forward to hearing what they say too. But it's really exciting. So yeah, thank you for coming and joining us.
Thank you. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our next panelist, Cathy Silver, a professor of educational psychology at the University of Oxford. I've certainly read some of Cathy's research reports, so it's amazing to have you here, Cathy. Would you like to share your thoughts on study?
Thank you very much, Angela. It seems to me that we have two really new domains of development which are assessed in the new assessment that all of you in the audience have helped to contribute to its first field trial. The first new domain is physical development. I'm only going to give 2 sentences because Iram is going to talk a lot about that. But I'd like to tell everybody, because Iram will not tell you, that it's because of Iram that we have physical development in this assessment. It's just for England, and Iram pioneered the measuring of physical development, but she also was tenacious in arguing, both with the DFE here at home, and then of course with the wider international panel, that we should be allowed to measure a physical development. So I'm not going to talk about that anymore because Iram is, but to me that's one of the 2 most innovative things that we're measuring in the new scale. The second, and this is what I will talk about, is what have been called 21st century skills. And 21st century skills are thinking skills, task persistence skills, being flexible and imaginative. And I reviewed the curriculum across Europe about 4 years ago for the European Union. And we found that all the countries that were in our big sample of 12 countries all were working in this century to adding to their early childhood curriculum what we might call 21st century skills. So this assessment package is absolutely on the cutting edge for measuring them. And it measures them in 2 ways. First, it measures them by the tablet tasks. We have the flexible thinking in the tablet task. We have the working memory in the tablet task, and we also have child's capacity to control impulses. So if we put these together, we can call it self-regulation or executive function, but it is working memory, remembering things so you can plan ahead, controlling your impulses so you can finish your task, and then, of course, being flexible in the way you think. So the first way that the new assessment has measured 21st century skills is through the tablet and through these three tasks on the tablet. But England was very innovative, and it also added to the 21st century skill kind of basket of measures, persistence. And here we developed a rating scale, and teachers and parents assess children's capacity to continue on a planned course of action despite obstacles. So I think if we put these four together, controlling impulses, remembering, and being flexible in our thinking, and on the tablet we measured, and then adding to that the rating scale of persistence, we really see the young child ready to thrive in the 21st century. In the last century, I'll tell you what 21st century skills are not. In the last century, since Dewey, since Froebel, since the early pioneers, we've known that we seek children's social development. That's always been in the curriculum. And in the last century, we added emerging academic skills, pre-literacy, pre-numeracy. We've had these emerging academic skills and social skills in the last century. But in this century, we have this basket of developmental domains, and I call them 21st century skills. They sit a little bit between the cognitive and the PSED. They're somewhere in the middle. Task persistence, being creative and inventive, reaching an obstacle in your play, and then being able to move sideways and get beyond that obstacle. So 21st century skills are really important. Fine. Now we know from a century of research that academic skills like vocabulary is terrifically shaped by social class. And of course, in this study, we're measuring it by free school meals. It's a crude measure, but it will do. So we know that social class absolutely shapes vocabulary, the words that the child's exposed to, the grammatical complexity of the sentences that are used in the home. It's middle-class parents don't just use more words, they use them in complicated sentences. And I'll give you just a little example. If I were you, I would march right upstairs and get my jacket and bring it back downstairs immediately. Okay, that's a very complicated sentence. If I were you, I would march upstairs. Think about marching upstairs. Armies march, but we're using this very creative word. Okay, we know that free school meals is highly related to the child's development of their language, of their early math skills. But is free school meals related to these 21st century skills? And our new study shows yes, that not only does the busy middle class parent shape the cognitive skills, the academic skills, they're also shaping 21st century skills. So we know from our study, and I think we had Caroline hinted at some of it, that there are things that parents do at home to develop these 21st century skills. They help children to read. If parents help their child to read 5 times a week or more, they are more likely to have children who have all of these 21st century skills. If they have more than 100 books, children's books in the home, they are highly likely to have children skip with all these 21st century skills. And if they take the children to activities outside the home and outside the setting, like sports activities, dance activities, Urdu classes on Saturday, special activities outside the home. So A, we know 21st century skills are important. B, we know that social class and social economic status shape 21st century skills, we know some of the things that parents do. And I'm going to end with just one Ofsted quote from an Ofsted report. Ofsted recently interviewed, I think it's 208 teachers and head teachers and managers. And they asked them, after COVID and after children are returning back to school, what are the areas of development that are most adversely affected? Think about it. What did teachers, head teachers, and managers say to Ofsted? The answer is personal, social, and emotional development has fallen behind. The head teachers and managers said half of the children have come back lacking in personal, social, and emotional development. Language development is only a quarter behind. So when we think of 21st century skills, how important they are, when we think that social class shapes them, when we think that what activities do every day, parents do every day in the home, or taking to the Urdu class on Saturday, how they shape these 21st century skills, and put on top, my final sentence will be, how has COVID exacerbated these divides? And so I end with kind of a toast to all the families who support 21st century skills, and the teachers and practitioners who are going to support them in their settings. And I think they're going to do it through play.
Thank you so much. And I think definitely getting that kind of balance right, and thinking about play now and children socialising is so important, for instance, as well. And rather than just focusing on reading or numeracy, so forth. We are running a little bit behind, but we did have a generous amount of time for Q&A, and so we'll still have some time for that. So don't worry. Do remember to send in your questions to Maddie. I'm now going to move on to our next panelist, who is another esteemed professor. So I'd like to welcome Iram Siraj from the University of Oxford. And Iram is a professor of child development and education. Again, somebody who's directed, managed many of the studies that I've been following over the years. So welcome, and please do share your thoughts.
Thank you very much. I mean, firstly, I'd like to thank the teachers, the NFER assessors, and the children who took part in the study, and to thank Caroline for her great presentation, to my colleague speakers and Angela. I bring a slightly different perspective because I was on the OECD International IELS team as well as being consultant to the NFER study in England. I was on the technical advisory group, and the first thing is that I was very impressed how the International Early Learning Study became known as the International Early Learning and Wellbeing Study. And this aspect of well-being is really critical in the early years to those of us who have, like myself, been or continue to be teachers. We scrutinised the review conducted for the OECD to provide them with the key domains of assessment. And clearly, most of the kinds of things that are assessed are some of the things you've heard about: executive function, self-regulation, literacy, numeracy. But some of us were also aware of other aspects of development that are really important, like physical development and other aspects of social emotional development, the proximity of home influence and so on. And we brought all of that to the table. Basically, this group worked on the what of what we should measure or assess. And the Australian Council for Educational Research, who won the tender to conduct and develop these assessments, led on the assessment framework. And we also decided together on using tablet-based assessments to directly assess children. I'll come back to that. So we chose Emergent Literacy, which you saw, but we chose not to look at direct reading and writing. So to focus on language and emergent literacy was really important because this is an international study. And although we depart from most of the world in having had our children in school for almost a year and a half, whereas other countries haven't had them in school at all normally. So it had to fit an international context. Emergent numeracy and, as we said, self-regulation, which actually was trialled in Poland. All the COG labs took place in Poland. And empathy and trust, which was developed with OECD, but with help from Canadian scholars who are specialists in that area. So the design and development of the IELTS assessments included 3 phases of item development. You were involved in 2 of them. There were item trials, there were field tests, and then the main study, and we're reporting really from the main study in England. The technical advisory group commented on each and the use of tablets to undertake the assessments with 5-year-olds. There were lots of questions around, should we use tablets to do direct assessments? Will children know what they're doing? Why is it tablet-based, some of our teachers were saying. Interestingly, in the COG labs, where the tests were undertaken with children, and it was interesting that they were in Poland, some of them, because the Polish children had very little experience of using tablets compared to some other countries, yet they had no problems in using them. They used them easily and enjoyed the experience because it was very intuitive. And that has been the case in all 3 countries. We've had feedback from schools and assessors and the children themselves. The IELTS indirectly assess through teacher and parent reports the cognitive and social emotional skills and behaviours. And this study is different from the other kind of PISA studies in that we have a lot of contextual information from parents and staff questionnaires as well, which we haven't touched on so much yet. And we worked on the adaptation and quality assurance provided. So things like we had a specialist Belgian organisation that looked at translations. These are experts on language and linguistics, and they looked at the nuances of different words and sentences in our instruments to ensure that they had the validity and the rigour to mean the same thing so we could make international comparisons. And I just want to end with an observation on the physical development assessment, which only happened in England because of the imagination and insight that DFE showed in integrating it. All the other countries only took what the international OECD recommended, yet we took the opportunity to develop something special and bespoke. Now, this was very important, not just to me, but to a lot of people. And I think this happening in England shows 3 important things. The first is that countries can develop, as well as doing the set measures for international early learning and well-being. We could, if we wanted, we could develop more bespoke instruments for this age group. The review of assessments for the OECD had few physical development measures. That's not because physical development isn't important, it's because we have few measures. So for me, that means here's an opportunity to develop something. So next time we might develop another assessment. And you should note that assessments for younger children are fewer, they're often less reliable, and they need more trialling. So we need reliable measures, and the IELTS studies is one way of countries helping in increasing the plethora of assessments we have. Secondly, the point about the interconnected nature of development, both Cassie and Kathy have picked up on this. Physical development is connected to the other 2 main domains of development, that is the cognitive and the social emotional. And showing that, to me, is really important, because if it's what us teachers have said all along, we've said all along that when we observe children, our pragmatic research, the data we collect day in, day out, going into schools, teaching children, assessing them. What we know about development is that the whole child is important, and that if there is one problem, like not having breakfast, which is a physical aspect, it affects other aspects of children's learning. And given that we have got food insecurity in some of our communities and all sorts of other things, this does become pretty important. And finally, in studies we undertook in Australia when I was working there for the last 5-6 years, we showed that in pre and post tests of children entering preschool and leaving preschool early years, that self-regulation, language and physical development was what more disadvantaged children were behind on. This study, which is much larger, shows the same. But the disheartening thing for me was that these particular children, when measured as they were leaving preschool, the gap had increased. So they might all have benefited from going to an early education rather than staying at home, but actually even within that early education, the gap increased. So we do need to make these connections. And finally, I'd just like to make one observation about the Eal findings. I think these are interesting. And maybe those children still need, maybe it's telling us that as children get older, not just in reception where there's play and more experiential learning, but as they're in year 1, maybe the language is becoming more disembedded from practical activities, and that we need more practical hands-on experiences for young children who are EAL and more disadvantaged where their language isn't developed so much. So maths not becoming more disembedded where it's linguistically more charged, but with manipulables and with physical activities. So for instance, the concept of stirring and the language around it is going to be far more real in a cooking activity with teachers than it is just talking about it. So finally, maybe there's a pedagogical approach to be considered for different groups of children, and this might also be the case for boys in some areas, because for disadvantaged children, and of course for the EAL and SEN children. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and so much in this study, and I know that there's so many opportunities for further analysis. So our final panelist, but certainly not the least, is Frances Forsyth, who is from the Early Years Outcomes and Interventions Research Team at the Department for Education. And of course, without the Department for Education's support, this wouldn't have happened because of not least the funding, but also just the support in getting it going. So over to you, Frances.
Thank you. And thank you to the other panelists for such interesting talks and reflections. But mainly, I would like to echo Caroline and the other panelists in thanking all the schools that took part and helped to make this study such a success. Caroline talked about the high response rate, so above 90% of schools and above 90% of children. That's great, but that has a practical implication. And of course, that means that the results are extremely reliable, and we can be very confident that they do represent 5-year-olds in England attending mainstream schools at the time the study was done in 2018. So I'll talk a little bit about why we decided to fund and support the development of this study, and also what the future may hold. So one of the reasons we wanted England to take part in this study is that simply before IELS there was very little internationally comparable evidence on early learning, that you could see what was happening in different countries and learn, you know, and see in a way that was comparable to what was happening here. You may be well aware that England already participates in a lot of well-established international education studies looking at older children. Probably the most famous being the PISA study, the Programme of International Student Assessment, which assesses 15-year-olds in maths, reading and science. Interestingly, the PISA study started in 1994 and had just 4 participating countries, and now it takes place every 3 years with around 80 different countries taking part. And we knew that OECD had been developing IELS for several years before it was actually launched. And there were various concerns. So some countries were concerned that the children would be too young for researchers to carry out meaningful assessments of their abilities. But in England, of course, and in the UK, we've carried out many national studies on children's early learning. We were very confident that this sort of study would work. We very much wanted to help it to get off the ground so that we can improve the evidence base on this really vital area of early learning. So I'm really pleased that the IELS study was a success, and I think it fulfilled two important aims. So first of all, it did show that it was possible to get schools and to get children to take part in a study of this sort, and to do so in a way that was engaging for children. So the innovative nature of the tablet-based assessments, where the children were kind of, that their skills were being assessed, but they were simply just enjoying it. You know, there were humorous pieces, there were parts of the content that were humorous that the children particularly enjoyed. They also really enjoyed the numeracy assessments and the opportunity to move items around on a screen. And you know, the assessments, you know, you'll have seen in progress, some of you. So yes, a proof of concept was very important, and Estonia and USA also achieved very high participation rates along with England. And then secondly, and probably most importantly, it provides a really comprehensive picture of the learning and development of 5-year-old children that we can compare internationally. So as we've seen, IELS showed that children in England on average did have strong learning and development outcomes in relation to the other participating countries. So especially in numeracy, and interestingly in positive behaviour, emergent literacy was very strong. But of course, the national averages mask some really important gaps between different subgroups of children, which we've also seen. So successive governments of all parties have, you know, been concerned for a very long time about the gap between disadvantaged children and their peers, the fact that these gaps emerge very early in life. And, you know, we know, of course, IELS was in 2018. We know that it shows us very starkly some of the inequalities, and we know that many of these will have widened during the pandemic. And in terms of evidence, in DFE, we draw on a very large range of evidence about the groups of children who tend to have development gaps, and then evidence on how to address them. So IELS is part of this, and has very important strengths in being internationally comparable, having really strong and precise, you know, we can measure the outcomes with a very high degree of precision, and of course being holistic, so covering the social and emotional and the executive function outcomes and physical development alongside literacy and numeracy, which we already know a lot about. I think continuing on the theme of evidence, I think, like any research, it's really important to use what IELS tells us alongside other evidence. So IELS can tell us where there are learning gaps, but it isn't really designed to tell us what to do about them. And that's where evidence on specific interventions and the effectiveness of different interventions comes in. So Cassie mentioned the Eef Toolkits. They summarise, you know, what interventions can be used to help children make additional progress, especially those children who've fallen behind. And, you know, relevant to the IELS results. So we see, you know, the Eef Toolkits have so many different types of, they assess so many different types of interventions. So for helping children with their social and emotional learning, as Cassie, I think, said about improving parental engagement, as well as improving language and communications and numeracy. So I'm sure you're very familiar with them, but I would encourage you to, you know, if you're interested in the development gaps that are in IELS and how to address them, that would be, you know, the most evidence-based place to start. And then so just finally, I'll say something about the future of IELS. Caroline mentioned there are more reports yet to come. So and the OECD have just published a very topical report on gender stereotypes and how prevalent they are even at age 5. And then we're looking forward to publishing the results of the further analysis on deprivation and on the fine motor and gross motor skills later this year, which hopefully will be around June time. that will be ready. And then in terms of the future of the study, OECD are planning to repeat IELTS every 5 years. So with the next round of fieldwork and the children being assessed in autumn 2023. And the first, of course, IELTS 2018 has been incredibly informative. Repeating the study will give us even more information because, of course, it will show trends over time. And this is going to be exceptionally relevant given the pandemic. Of course, we can see 5-year-olds in 2018, and then we can see 5-year-olds in 2023. The other positive is that more countries are expected to sign up now that they've seen that it can work. So there'll be a larger number of countries to compare with and to learn from. So we're expecting a decision. There's a sort of formal process. So we expect a decision later this year on whether England will take part, because it's, well, you've probably heard the phrase, civil servants advise and the ministers decide. So we're expecting a decision later this year. And then one thing to note is that if we do sign up for IELTS 2023, we'd be drawing a new random sample of around 200 primary schools. And as there's more than 16,000 primary schools in England, it's fairly unlikely that your school would be asked to take part again in future. So it just remains for me to say thank you again for being part of the 2018 study and for helping to make it such a success. And I look forward to hearing your questions.
Thank you so much, Frances, and good to hear that hopefully it will go ahead. I was just thinking about some of the other international studies, and PISA, I think, has got about 80 participating countries. And so can you imagine the richness of information when you start getting more and more countries? It will be fantastic. I've certainly learnt a lot. We have a few questions, not very many, but I think quite fitting, given where we are. So I suppose the first one is relating to, I mean, what's been shown is the importance of physical development as well as, you know, some of these cognitive processes. So as children are going back to school, what should children be focusing on in terms of COVID recovery? I have these special buttons where I can see if any of those panelists want to answer. Otherwise, I'm going to pick on Cathy.
I'll just begin. I think that there are two twin goals in the early years curriculum, and they will be communication and language and personal, social, and emotional development. I think those two should be the focus, and you can do them together. We have some very good evidence-based, Frances, you'll enjoy this, interventions that, you know, really help children's language. And I think it's building relationships with other children, trusting relationships, Iram, as we've measured trust in IELTS. So I would begin on those two. And I'd like Iram to talk about how she would foster them.
I think I'll let Cassie go in there because they're doing it.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're doing what Cathy said. We've gone back at my primary school, like I'm sure many of you do, first principles. So trying to think about those three things that really make a difference to young children. So reading with children, reading to children, building in experiences, because what we've noticed is that children have come to school and they haven't done those things like going to the hairdressers or going to the shops or meeting a dog on the street. So they're the things that we're thinking, okay, that we need to do those experiences now. And then the third one is play. So actually meeting the children where they are and using their play to build those complicated sentences that Cathy talks about. So we know we have to do phonics, we know we have to do the other things, but we also know from children higher up the school that if we get this bit right, if we can build the language and the self-regulation and the experiences so that children can craft the next steps on really solid real life experiences, and that will help. That's what worked last time, so that's where we're starting again.
I think that's absolutely right, and it justifies what Catherine Snow at Harvard says about language development. She says that it's not the word gap. It's the lack of experience of the world gap. If you haven't got the experience, then you haven't got the words to put to it. If you have the experience, it's so much easier to understand. Cassie put it so beautifully, you know, even meeting dogs on the street, you know, going shopping, learning about the hairdresser. A lot of those experiences have been sadly missed for children for, if they're coming into school, 20% of their lives.
Yeah, absolutely. So, you know, the more varied experiences you have, then you have a need to find a word for it. Yeah, absolutely. Sorry, I've got to move us on. So persistence is important. I mean, I kind of wish I'd found this out, you know, a bit earlier when my children were younger, but do we know is there an evidence-based way to improve persistence, and what could be done in the classroom?
Well, working with teachers, we've on professional development, which includes improving self-regulation and persistence of children. Many teachers tell us how much they've learned when they do the professional development and how much their own persistence and self-regulation is important. It's like Kathy saying, you know, the penny dropped in relation to one thing, and it happens in professional development for teachers. And I think a lot of what we've experienced ourselves adds to the knowledge that we have. And learning about persistence ourselves is probably a really important starting point. I mean, even you said it. You said, I wish I'd known this. And I think that's what most teachers were saying to us. We wish we'd known this about ourselves. You know, we're not monitoring our own self-regulation, our own persistence. And we know that that impacts on children in the same way that Kathy and I research on how those same skills as in parenting end up impacting on children if you have them or don't have them.
Thank you. I've got another one, which is I'm going to direct to Francis. There's quite a lot of information in the presentation about parenting and what parents can do. Are we doing enough to engage with parents? And is there more that schools or even government can do?
Well, taking the schools point, you probably won't be surprised to say that there are, so both in the teaching and learning toolkit and in the early years toolkit, there are strategies for parental engagement. You know, that they have, you know, based, you know, they can help children to make, you know, 4 to 6 months additional progress. So I would go there for the evidence base on what schools can do. In terms of what government is doing, you'll probably be aware that, you know, for many years government didn't really want to get into the space of telling parents how to parent. You know, there was a great nervousness about that. But the evidence on the home learning environment has been so strong. Of course, Kathy and Iram have been, you know, instrumental in building some of this evidence as well over the years. You might be aware of the Hungry Little Minds campaign, which is about bringing information together about what parents of young children can do just to help, you know, to help with their language development. You know, just the simple things like read, chat, play. And then IELS helps us to understand what parents, you know, I think it's important to help parents understand, firstly, that what they do really matters, and then secondly, that it's actually quite simple. You know, things like talking to your child about their feelings. A lot of parents will be reassured because they pretty much do that already. So I think it's I suppose in terms of what government's doing, it's sort of more, it's kind of treading into the space of giving information about what parents can do.
Okay, and I also know that Cassie would like to contribute.
Yeah, only to say that there's been a really interesting report. I think it's the Royal Foundation, can't quite remember, that talks about how to do it really positively, that if you sort of put pressure on parents and say, you must do this, you must do that, don't forget you've got to read that reading book every night, that actually that can have almost a negative impact. And it's something that our colleagues in the East London Research School, led by Dr. Julian Grenier, are sort of looking at. How do you develop that relationship positively? So how do you, and the Hungry Little Minds campaign does that really well. So how do you meet parents where they are and slowly build their confidence so that they don't find parenting any more stressful than it is, really? You can do more damage than good, sort of putting lots of pressure on parents with hundreds of worksheets and tasks to complete.
Thank you. I actually don't have any more questions from the floor, and I'm going to take this opportunity to just say thank you very much. I don't know if anybody has any final thoughts. No. I hope to everybody who's been listening that you found this an engaging session. As everybody has thanked you, there are new things coming out of this study. I think that's the important thing, you know, and you know, you might think, oh, actually I've heard some of this before, but some of this is new and will help us to make sure that children's outcomes are as supported as we possibly can be. And also we're always trying in NFER to think through how we can improve outcomes and also reduce that attainment gap. So I'm sure there's a rich stream of information that you contributed to. Hopefully you've got some pointers with regards to what you might think about. Do get involved in research again, and have a lovely evening.